Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep, real deep, into the crunchy, crinkly heart of an unsung hero, the humble cabbage. We'll explore its journey from ancient panacea to, well, still a pretty decent coleslaw ingredient. But you probably won't survive this deep dive without a nap. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself drifting, the gentle hum of your fan, or perhaps just the quiet of your room, transforming into the soft rustle of unseen leaves, the distant murmur of ancient voices. We're stepping back, way back, to where the story of cabbage, this unassuming vegetable, first begins to unfurl, much like its own tightly packed leaves. We're in a world without supermarkets, without neatly packaged produce, a world where every plant holds a secret, a potential cure, or a simple means of sustenance. This is the leafy lure, the very dawn of ancient cabbage cures. Imagine, if you will, the fertile banks of the Nile. You can almost feel the warm, dry air, smell the rich, dark earth that yields such abundance. Here, in ancient Egypt, amongst the papyrus reeds and the monumental efforts of a civilization building for eternity, cabbage makes some of its earliest known appearances. It's not headlining the medical papyri like some other, more exotic herbs. No, cabbage is more of a quiet background worker. You see it depicted in agricultural scenes, a familiar, almost comforting presence in their fields. The Egyptians, masterful farmers as they were, certainly cultivated various forms of Brassica oleracea, the wild ancestor of our modern cabbages, kales, and broccoli. It was a reliable food source, hardy and nutritious. They wouldn't have called it cabbage in the way we do. Of course, the names lost to time or perhaps just incredibly difficult to pronounce after a long day in the sun. While direct, explicit cabbage cures in the grand Egyptian medical texts like the Papyrus Ebers are a little elusive for our head-forming varieties, it's understood that leafy greens in general were part of their diet and, by extension, their understanding of health. They believed in a balance, in foods that sustained and perhaps gently cleansed. Think of cabbage not as a targeted antibiotic, but as part of a holistic approach, a way to keep the body running smoothly, which, when you're building pyramids, is probably quite important. You wouldn't want to call in sick with a note from your mom saying you ate too much rich food. They likely used it in simple ways, boiled, perhaps, or added to stews. The very act of cultivating and consuming these hardy greens would have been seen as promoting vitality. A mainstream historical fact for you: the ancient Egyptians were known for their sophisticated agricultural techniques, including irrigation, which allowed them to grow a variety of crops, cabbage's ancestors among them, in an otherwise arid region. Now, let your mind drift westwards, across the shimmering Mediterranean, towards the sun-drenched lands of ancient Greece. Here, the story of cabbage becomes a little louder, a bit more opinionated. The Greeks, with their penchant for philosophy, debate, and, well, wine, had quite a bit to say about this leafy vegetable. You're now walking through an ancient agora, the scent of olive oil, herbs, and maybe a hint of roasting meat in the air. Scholars and physicians are discussing the nature of the world, and yes, even the properties of vegetables. Hippocrates, often hailed as the father of medicine, and whose name you might recognize from the oath doctors still take, though perhaps he didn't envision it being recited under quite so much student loan debt, mentioned cabbage. He and his followers emphasized diet as a cornerstone of health, and cabbage, in its various forms, would have been part of that dietary landscape. They weren't just eating it, they were thinking about it. What does it do to the body? How does it interact with other foods, with our humors? This is where we encounter some of the more specific, and sometimes rather charming, medicinal beliefs. One of the most famous and enduring was cabbage's reputation as a cure for hangovers. Yes, you heard that right. Before your modern concoctions of electrolyte drinks and questionable diner breakfasts, the ancient Greeks might have reached for a hearty helping of cabbage. The physician Diphilus of Sipnos, for example, recommended it. Imagine a symposium, a lively Greek party, getting a little too lively. The next morning, amidst the scattered wine cups and philosophical remnants, someone's probably suggesting a bit of cabbage to clear the head. It makes you wonder if it was the cabbage itself, or just the sheer determination to eat cabbage while hungover that did the trick. And here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit for you some ancient Greeks, perhaps after a particularly enthusiastic symposium, believed that cabbage actually sprang from the sweat of Zeus Picture, the king of the gods, working up a sweat on Mount Olympus, and poof, a patch of cabbage appears. It certainly gives divine intervention a whole new, slightly damp meaning. This mythological origin, however silly it sounds to us, elevated the plant, imbuing it with a certain mystique, a connection to the gods, which could only have enhanced its perceived medicinal power. Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle and another key figure in early botany, also cataloged different types of cabbage, noting their characteristics. He wasn't just focused on cures, but on understanding the plant itself, its form, its growth, its varieties. This systematic approach laid groundwork for later botanical studies. The Greeks recognized that not all cabbage was the same. Historians still argue whether the wild ancestor of our modern cabbage, the Brassica oleracea, var. oleracea, nut, more closely resembled a loose-leaf kale, or if early cultivation had already coaxed it into forming a more compact head in some regions. It's one of those delightful academic puzzles, like trying to figure out which came first, the chicken or the egg salad sandwich. These early beliefs weren't always based on rigorous scientific trials. Of course, they were a blend of observation, tradition, a little bit of sympathetic magic perhaps. This plant is hardy, therefore it imparts hardiness. If a food was bitter, it might be seen as purifying. If it caused, shall we say, a bit of internal rumbling, well, that must be it working its magic, clearing things out. The Greeks also used cabbage externally. Poultices of crushed cabbage leaves were applied to wounds and swellings, a practice that, surprisingly, echoes through folk medicine for centuries. The idea was that the leaves could draw out impurities or reduce inflammation. You can almost feel the cool, slightly rough texture of a cabbage leaf poultice, a very direct, very green approach to healing. So, as we stand at this very early point in our journey, you see cabbage beginning to establish its credentials. It's a food, yes, a staple that keeps hunger at bay. But it's also something more. In Egypt, it's a quiet supporter of health, part of the agricultural rhythm of life. In Greece, it steps into the intellectual and medicinal spotlight, debated by physicians, linked to gods, and prescribed for ailments ranging from the after effects of a good party to the more serious concerns of wounds and internal balance. It's the very beginning of a long and fascinating relationship between humans and this surprisingly versatile plant. The seeds of its reputation as a healer, a protector, a sometimes pungent but always present ally are being sown in these ancient soils. And from these humble beginnings, the leafy lure of cabbage will only grow stronger, its story branching out in fascinating and occasionally bizarre directions. We're just getting started. And so, with that initial glimpse into the peculiar ways our ancestors, those charmingly optimistic souls we mentioned earlier, tried to stay alive, you find yourself now drifting gently back through time. The grand amphitheaters and bustling forums of Rome begin to materialize around you, not just in their sun-bleached marble glory, but in the quiet, everyday moments of life and, well, illness. Because, as you know, even the Romans, with all their roads and legions, their epic poems, and their rather impressive plumbing, weren't immune to a rumbling stomach or a nasty scrape that just wouldn't heal. You can almost hear the distant clatter of a chariot. Feel the warm Mediterranean sun on your skin, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of something earthy. And what was their go-to? Their secret weapon? Their, dare I say, ancient equivalent of that one friend who insists apple cider vinegar cures everything you might be picturing, exotic herbs imported from the farthest, most sun-drenched corners of the empire, or perhaps some complex bubbling concoction brewed by a mysterious toga-clad physician with an impressive scroll collection. But no, your senses guide you to something far more humble. You're now standing in a simple Roman garden, or perhaps browsing a stall in a busy market, the air smelling faintly of damp earth, maybe a hint of rosemary, and, yes, cabbage. Rows and rows of it in all its leafy, unassuming glory. Brassica oleracea, if you want to get technical, though the Romans just called it brassica. It seems the Romans, or at least one very influential, very vocal, and frankly, rather stubborn Roman, fell head over heels, completely and utterly, for the humble cabbage. This wasn't just a culinary staple, a simple side dish to accompany their roasted dormice. Yes, that was a thing. Oh no. For some, cabbage was medicine. Serious, life-saving, cure-all medicine. At least according to one particularly loud and opinionated voice from the era Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Elder, as he's more famously known. You can almost picture him now, a stern, no-nonsense Roman statesman, a farmer at heart, a man who probably thought anything more complicated than a well-tilled field or a properly sharpened gladius was a sign of creeping moral decay. He was the kind of guy who'd tell you to pull yourself up by your sandal straps, and he really, passionately believed in cabbage. His writings on agriculture, De Agricultura, which, incidentally, is one of the earliest complete works of Latin prose that has survived to this day, a mainstream historical fact. For your collection, aren't just farming manuals. Oh no, nestled amongst advice on vineyard management and olive pressing, you find an entire section, a veritable love letter, dedicated to the medicinal virtues of cabbage. It's not just a recommendation, it's practically a divine revelation delivered via cruciferous vegetable. Cato claimed cabbage could, and you might want to sit down for this list, basically solve all of life's little discomforts. Let's start with digestion, a common Roman concern, especially after one of their famously indulgent banquets. You feel that post-feast bloat coming on, Cato says. Reach for the cabbage. Raw cabbage, mind you, perhaps with a little vinegar. He believed it would make you feel as if you had not eaten, and you can drink as much as you like. A bold claim, especially for a culture that wasn't exactly shy about its wine consumption. It wasn't just for after the fact, either. He advocated eating cabbage before. A big meal to ward off the ill effects of overindulgence. So, forget your modern digestive enzymes. Cato's got a cabbage leaf for that. Then, there are wounds. You've got a cut, a bruise, an ulcer, maybe even a dislocated joint. Cato's prescription, a cabbage poultice. You'd take the cabbage, mash it up. Imagine the slightly sulfurous scent filling the air. the cool, damp leaves against your skin, and apply it directly to the afflicted area. He was convinced it could cleanse wounds, reduce swelling, and speed up healing for almost anything. He even specified different types of cabbage for different applications, though the distinctions are a bit lost on us now. It's like he had a whole cabbage pharmacy in his garden. But Cato's cabbage crusade didn't stop there. Oh no, he was just warming up. He believed it could expel phlegm, cure headaches, and even help with failing eyesight or deafness. Feeling a bit under the weather cabbage. Worried about a lingering cough cabbage. Suspect your neighbor's giving you the evil eye. Probably cabbage for that too, just in case. He even, and this is where things get a tad more unique, advocated for the use of cabbage in ways that might make you wrinkle your nose. For instance, a quirky little tidbit. For you, Cato suggested that the urine of a person who regularly ate a lot of cabbage had healing properties itself and could be used as a wash for sores or even to bathe weak infants. Yes, you heard that right. We'll just let that one sit there for a moment. Modern science might have a few notes on that particular remedy. You can almost feel the fervent conviction radiating from his words. A near fanatical devotion to this one vegetable. It wasn't just about health, it was about Roman identity. Cato was famously wary of Greek influence, especially Greek doctors with their fancy theories and expensive, often useless treatments. For him, cabbage was pure, simple, and thoroughly Roman, a symbol of the old, virtuous ways. Why pay some smooth-talking Greek physician a fortune for unctions and incantations when good old Roman cabbage, grown in good old Roman soil, could do the trick? It was practically a patriotic duty to choose cabbage. You can almost hear him grumbling. Those Greeks, with their spices and philosophy. What you need is a good head of cabbage. Son, nor. Historians still argue whether Cato's fervent promotion of cabbage was purely based on his own, perhaps somewhat biased, empirical observations of its effects, or if it was more deeply intertwined with his staunch, traditionalist Roman values and his profound suspicion of any foreign, particularly Greek, influences creeping into Roman life, including its medicine. Perhaps it was a bit of both. He saw something that he believed worked, and it fit perfectly with his worldview. Now, we know today that cabbage is indeed good for you. It's packed with vitamins and fiber. So, Cato wasn't entirely off his rocker, even if his claims for its universal healing powers were, shall we say, a touch optimistic. It makes you wonder, though, how many Romans diligently munched on raw cabbage or applied leafy poultices, all on the stern advice of their revered elder statesmen. You can imagine the Roman kitchens, the air thick with the smell of boiling cabbage, not just for dinner, but for Daddy's aching knee or Junior's persistent cough. It's a slightly less glamorous image than chariots and gladiators, but a very real part of Roman daily life. The power of belief, especially when championed by such a forceful personality, could make even the most common of vegetables seem like a miracle cure. And for a time, in the heart of the mighty Roman Republic, cabbage was king. And so, you find yourself drifting, not through the grand libraries of Alexandria this time, nor the bustling forums filled with orators, but into the quieter, more intimate spaces of Roman life. You're stepping into the heart of their daily routines, their simple comforts, and yes, their everyday aches and pains. Remember how we touched upon the Roman penchant for practical solutions, often rooted in what nature provided? Well, hold on to that thought, because we're about to delve deep into the world of a vegetable that, for the Romans, was far more than just a side dish. We're talking about cabbage. Yes, good old brassica. Oleracea. Imagine, for a moment, you're walking through a Roman insula, one of those apartment blocks in the city, or perhaps a more spacious domus. The air, thick with the scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and something else, something earthy, pungent, maybe a little bit sulfurous. That, my friend, could very well be the smell of cabbage simmering away, not just for dinner, but as a go-to remedy. In the Roman home, cabbage was the Swiss Army knife of the kitchen garden. Feeling a bit under the weather, a little too much wine at last night's convivium, Cato the Elder, whose pronouncements on agriculture and health we've encountered, would have had strong opinions on this. He believed, quite fervently, that cabbage could cure almost anything. He'd probably tell you to eat it raw before a big meal to prevent drunkenness, or to use its juice to cleanse wounds. You might see a concerned mother carefully crushing cabbage leaves to make a poultice for her child's scraped knee, the green juice staining her fingers as she works. The belief was strong, almost an article of faith, that this humble plant held potent healing powers. It was thought to soothe inflammations, aid digestion, a big one in a society fond of its feasts, and generally keep the body in good order. You know how today we have those superfoods that everyone raves about: kale smoothies, goji berries? Well, cabbage was the Roman equivalent, just without the fancy branding and the eye-watering price tag. And that's a key point: its accessibility. Cabbage was cheap, easy to grow in most climates the Romans inhabited, from the misty fields of Britannia to the sun-baked plots in North Africa. This meant it wasn't just a remedy for the wealthy elite who could afford exotic spices and imported medicines. Oh no, cabbage was for everyone. The plebeian struggling to make ends meet could still rely on cabbage from his small garden patch or the local market to treat his family's ailments. It crossed social strata, a common thread in the fabric of Roman health. Now, let's march out of the city for a bit, leave the domestic scenes behind, and find ourselves in the far more rugged environment of a Roman military camp. Picture the scene: rows of leather tents, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and, yes, cabbage again. The life of a Roman legionary was tough, no doubt about it. Long marches, heavy gear, brutal training, and the ever-present threat of skirmishes or full-blown battles. Illness and injury were constant companions. So, how did they cope? Well, alongside their impressive logistical skills and medical officers, they had cabbage, lots of it. It was practically a regulation vegetable. The military understood the importance of keeping its soldiers fit, and cabbage was seen as a key preventative, consumed regularly. It was believed to ward off sickness, to keep the humors balanced, and to maintain a soldier's strength and stamina on campaign. Think of it as their ancient, leafy multivitamin. They wouldn't have known about vitamin C, of course, but they saw the results, or at least, they believed. They saw the results: fewer men falling ill to the various fevers and fluxes that could decimate an army. So, you'd find it in the soldiers' rations, perhaps boiled into a hearty, if not particularly gourmet, stew. One can almost hear the grumbling from a legionary. Not pulse with cabbage again. Marcus by Jupiter. My toga will start to photosynthesize. But it wasn't just for eating. When injuries occurred, and they frequently did, from sprains and bruises during training to sword cuts and spear wounds in battle, cabbage was often the first line of topical treatment. The camp medics, or even the soldiers themselves, would prepare cabbage poultices. Fresh leaves, crushed to release their juice, would be applied directly to wounds. The thinking, much like in civilian life, was that the cabbage would draw out infection, reduce swelling, and promote healing. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Roman military had organized medical services, including field hospitals, or valetudinaria, and these would have been well stocked with such common remedies. You can almost imagine the slightly eye-watering aroma of a Roman field hospital, a unique blend of herbs, vinegar used as an antiseptic, and the unmistakable scent of decomposing cabbage poultices. Charming, I know. But if it meant a wound healed quicker and a soldier could return to duty, then who were they to complain about the smell? They were practical people, these Romans. If it worked, or seemed to work, they used it. The specific applications were varied, sometimes bordering on the optimistic. Cato, for instance, even suggested that the smoke from burning cabbage could be beneficial for certain ailments, or that cabbage juice instilled into the ear could improve hearing. A particularly quirky and lesser-known tidbit is its reputation as a hangover cure. Given the Roman fondness for wine, this was a remedy that probably saw a lot of action. The idea was that eating raw cabbage, especially before indulging, could counteract the effects of alcohol. Pliny the Elder, another prolific writer, cataloged numerous uses for cabbage, attributing to it properties that could combat everything from headaches to melancholy, and even act as an antidote to certain poisons. Though I wouldn't recommend testing that last one yourself. It's like they thought, well, it's green, it's slightly bitter, it must be powerful. And sometimes that belief is half the battle, isn't it? Now, this widespread reliance on cabbage does lead to some interesting discussions among those who study the past. Historians still argue whether the perceived extensive medical benefits of cabbage truly translated into significant positive public health outcomes for the Roman population, or if its efficacy was more a product of strong belief, amplified by influential figures like Cato, rather than purely physiological effects. Were they really staving off scurvy with their cabbage rations without knowing why? Or was it more of a placebo effect for many common ailments? It's hard to say definitively from this distance in time. We can analyze the chemical compounds in cabbage today and see anti-inflammatory properties. Sure. But how that translated in Roman preparations and dosages is another matter. So, as you see the Roman matron carefully tending her kitchen garden, or the legionary dutifully munching on his cabbage ration, you get a real sense of its place in their world. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of self-sufficiency, of nature's bounty providing for human needs, a readily available comfort in a world full of uncertainties. It was their all-purpose green helper, their leafy guardian against the small and sometimes large miseries of life. Perhaps the next time you're making coleslaw, you can give a little nod to the Romans. They really believed in that stuff. You almost have to admire their commitment to the cruciferous. Nabi. And so, as the grand Roman infrastructure, remember all those aqueducts and perfectly straight roads we talked about? Well, as that starts to crumble, sometimes quite literally, and gets repurposed into, oh, I don't know, very fancy goat pens or bits of fortified walls, the extensive knowledge of our humble brassica, all those insights from Cato and Pliny, doesn't just poof out of existence. It just finds a quieter, more contemplative place to hang out for a few centuries. You drift now away from the bustling, if slightly chaotic, late Roman markets, and find yourself approaching a different kind of structure. The air grows cooler, carries the faint scent of damp stone, beeswax, and something herbal, something green. You are entering the medieval period, and specifically, the often surprisingly serene world of the monastery. These pockets of scholarship and devotion become crucial sanctuaries. Imagine stone walls, perhaps a little mossy, enclosing a courtyard. Somewhere, a bell tolls, a low, resonant sound that seems to vibrate right through you. Inside, in a room known as a scriptorium, lit by flickering oil lamps or the precious light from a narrow window, you see monks. They are hunched over desks, their faces serene, or perhaps occasionally etched with the concentration of trying to decipher a faded passage. The silence is punctuated only by the soft scratch of a quill on parchment, the rustle of a turning page, the occasional quiet cough. These aren't just any texts they're copying with such painstaking care. Alongside the scriptures and theological treatises, they are meticulously preserving the wisdom of the ancients. Yes, Galen's complex theories on humors, which we touched upon, are being carefully transcribed. His ideas on balancing hot, cold, moist, and dry still holding sway. Dioscorides, De Materia Medica, a D, that foundational work of herbal knowledge, is another treasured text, passed down, recopied, its illustrations sometimes taking on a charmingly medieval character, and, of course, the agricultural and encyclopedic writings of figures like Pliny the Elder, with all their mentions of cabbage's virtues, are also being saved from oblivion. But it's not just about dusty old books. Step outside the scriptorium, and you find yourself in the monastery's herb garden, the Hortus Medicus, or Physic Garden. This isn't some wild, untamed patch. It's usually a neatly ordered space, often laid out in raised beds, a living library of medicinal plants. And there, growing robustly, is our familiar friend, the cabbage. Rows of it, in its various forms, perhaps the tight-headed cabbages we're more familiar with, or looser-leafed kales. All descendants of that wild ancestor we met on the windy coasts. Monks, after all, needed to be largely self-sufficient. Food, medicine, it all had to come from their own lands and their own hands. Cabbage, being hardy, nutritious, and relatively easy to cultivate in the often less than ideal European climate, was a dietary mainstay. You can almost hear the silent, collective sigh of monks facing yet another Tuesday, which, like most days, is cabbage soup day. Though, bless their hearts, they probably had, like, 7 different exciting recipes for boiled cabbage with a hint of prayer. Now, here's where things get interesting. The monks aren't just passively copying Roman texts and planning what Roman agronomists recommended. They are living in a different world, with its own established local traditions, its own folk remedies, its own understanding of the plants that grew around them. So, what you see happening is a fascinating blend. The classical knowledge, filtered through texts, is being interwoven with this evolving European herbalism. A local granny's poultice for a swollen joint, perhaps made with crushed cabbage leaves and a bit of pig fat, might now be explained by a learned monk through the lens of humoral theory. Ah yes, the cabbage is cooling and drying. Thus it counteracts the hot, moist humor causing the inflammation. The granny, one imagines, just nods politely, glad that the fancy Latin explanation somehow confirms her poultice works. A mainstream historical fact for you, the plan of St. Gall, an architectural drawing from the early 9th century, depicts an ideal Benedictine monastery complex, and it very clearly includes a physic garden with specific beds for medicinal herbs, as well as a vegetable garden for kitchen use. This shows just how integrated plant cultivation for both food and medicine was into monastic life from very early on. They weren't just praying, they were very practical. This blending wasn't always seamless. Sometimes classical wisdom would be adapted, perhaps simplified, or even misinterpreted as it passed through generations of copying and translation, and new observations were being made. Monks were often keen observers of nature. Maybe Brother Cuthbert discovered cabbage juice helps with ink stains purely by accident after a particularly vigorous session transcribing Pliny's thoughts on, well, cabbage. Or perhaps he noted that a particular preparation of cabbage seemed to soothe the abbot's persistent cough, a cough not quite covered in the ancient texts. This practical, experiential knowledge would then be added to the corpus. Early medical texts from this period, like the Anglo-Saxon leech books, reflect this fusion. You'll find entries for cabbage that might echo some of the classical uses, for digestion, for wounds, but also perhaps remedies with a distinctly local flavor, maybe involving other native herbs or specific rituals alongside the application of the cabbage. And a quirky little tidbit, while some revered cabbage, not everyone was a fan of it raw. The famous abbess and mystic Hildegard von Bingen, writing a bit later in the High Middle Ages, cautioned against eating raw cabbage, believing it could cause melancholy due to its strong and troublesome greenness. But she found cooked cabbage to be perfectly acceptable and even beneficial. See, even mystics had strong opinions on how to prepare your greens. The exact nature of this knowledge preservation and adaptation is something scholars still ponder. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for preserving medicinal plant knowledge in monasteries was purely utilitarian health care for the monastic community and surrounding lay people, or if it also served as an intellectual exercise, a continuation of scholarly tradition for its own sake, a way to keep the lamp of learning lit, however dimly it sometimes seemed to flicker in the wider world. So, as you watch these medieval monks tending their cabbages, carefully noting their properties, and blending ancient wisdom with new experiences, you see our leafy hero not just surviving, but evolving. It's becoming deeply embedded in the nascent medical traditions of Europe, its reputation as a versatile remedy solidifying within the quiet, often damp, but surprisingly dynamic, walls of the medieval monastery. The cabbage is safe, for now, its story being written, leaf by leaf, in these secluded havens of learning and cultivation. And the air, it still carries that faint, earthy promise of soup, lots and lots of soup. And so, you find yourself in a world where that humble, unassuming cabbage, the one we might now relegate to a forgotten corner of the crisper drawer, holds a place of surprising honor. Not just on the dinner table, though it certainly saw plenty of action there, as we've touched upon, but in the realm of everyday healing, a go-to remedy whispered down through generations. You see, in the Middle Ages, and well into the Renaissance, when apothecaries were perhaps a town away, or their concoctions too dear for the common purse, the cabbage in your garden patch was your first line of defense against a host of minor, and sometimes not so minor, afflictions. Imagine, for a moment, you've had a bit of a tumble. Maybe you tripped over a stray cobblestone, or perhaps a rather enthusiastic game of, oh, let's call it medieval kick the bladder, has left you with a throbbing ankle or a spectacularly colorful bruise blooming on your arm. What's the first thing your village's wise woman, or even your own grandmother, might suggest? You guessed it, the cabbage. You can almost feel the cool, slightly waxy surface of a large outer leaf in your hand. Someone, perhaps you, would take several of these robust leaves, maybe the ones deemed a bit too tough for the pot, and set about preparing them. You might see them gently bruised with a wooden mallet or the smooth side of a river stone, just enough to release their inner cabbageness, the distinct, earthy, almost peppery scent, with that faint sulfurous note we all know, begins to fill the air. It's not an unpleasant smell, not really, just distinctive. Like the smell of old books or damp earth after rain, it's a scent that carries memories and associations. These bruised leaves, now slightly softened and yielding, would be carefully arranged over the swollen joint or the tender discolored skin. Sometimes they were applied cool, directly from the plant, offering an immediate, soothing chill to an inflamed area. You can imagine the relief, that initial sigh as the natural coolness begins to draw out the heat. Other times, the leaves might be very slightly warmed, perhaps by blanching them quickly in hot water or laying them near the hearth. The idea being that a gentle warmth could encourage circulation or help the cabbage's healing properties penetrate more deeply. Then, the whole thing would be bound in place with a strip of linen or whatever clean cloth was at hand. It was practically the medieval equivalent of slapping some ice on it and hoping for the best. Except, greener and decidedly smellier. You'd wear this fragrant green bandage for hours, perhaps even overnight, the cabbage leaf slowly wilting against your skin, a silent testament to its supposed work. And what did they believe this humble vegetable was doing? Well, the concept of humors, those vital fluids we've talked about, was still very much in play. An injury, a swelling, a bruise. These were often seen as an imbalance, an accumulation of bad humors or blocked energy. The cabbage, with its drawing properties, was thought to pull out these noxious substances, to cleanse the area, and to restore balance. It's fascinating, really, because while their understanding of the mechanism might have been different from ours, they weren't entirely off base. We now know that cabbage contains compounds like glucosinolates, which have anti-inflammatory properties. So, while they were thinking drawing out bad humors, their bodies might have actually been benefiting from some genuine biochemical assistance. This is one of those lovely instances where folk wisdom, honed over centuries of trial and error, bumps up against modern science in a surprisingly agreeable way. Cato the Elder, that rather stern Roman statesman and writer, famously extolled the virtues of cabbage, claiming it could cure a vast array of ailments, and his writings were certainly known and respected, filtering down through the ages and bolstering cabbage's medicinal reputation. But the uses of cabbage didn't stop at the purely physical, at the bumps and bruises of daily life. Oh no. When the ailment was a bit more mysterious, a bit more unseen, the cabbage often found itself enlisted in rituals and charms, blurring the line between folk medicine and what we might now call superstition. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of these cabbage poultices were purely placebo, or if the anti-inflammatory compounds we now know are present in cabbage actually provided some measurable relief beyond just soothing coolness. It's a debate that adds another layer to our understanding of these practices. Imagine a restless sleeper, plagued by bad dreams or an unquiet mind. It wasn't unheard of for fresh cabbage leaves to be placed beneath the pillow, or even under the bed itself, with the belief that their calming essence, or perhaps some inherent protective quality, would ensure peaceful slumber and ward off troubling spirits of the night. You can almost picture someone carefully selecting the smoothest, most perfect leaves for this purpose. A quiet ritual performed in the dim light of a flickering candle. There's a certain charm to the idea, isn't there? A simple green guardian against the shadows? And then there were the more proactive charms. Cabbage leaves might be hung over doorways, not for decoration, mind you, but as a kind of organic amulet intended to protect the household from sickness or ill fortune. The specific rituals varied from region to region, from village to village, each with its own particular nuances. Perhaps the leaves had to be gathered at a certain phase of the moon, or blessed with a spoken incantation. If your love life was wilting faster than a cabbage leaf in the sun, well, maybe there was a cabbage charm for that too, involving carefully folded leaves or patterns discerned in their veins. Results, of course, were not guaranteed, but in a world with fewer certainties, these small acts of faith, these appeals to the hidden virtues of common things, provided a measure of comfort and a sense of agency. There's even a quirky little tidbit about cabbage being used to combat the after effects of too much ale or wine, a folk remedy for hangovers. Some believed that chewing raw cabbage leaves or applying them as a cool compress to a throbbing head could clear the fog and settle the stomach, a little hair of the dog, or perhaps leaf of the cabbage, as it were. It speaks volumes about cabbage's versatility in their eyes. It wasn't just for sustenance or serious injuries, but for the minor discomforts and even the self-inflicted woes of life. So, you see, this everyday vegetable, so common it was almost invisible, carried a surprising weight of belief and tradition. It was a poultice, a charm, a quiet comfort, a testament to the resourcefulness of people who lived closely with the natural world, finding their pharmacy in the garden and their solace in the familiar. You can almost feel the slightly rough, cool texture of a freshly plucked leaf, ready to be applied, ready to work its everyday magic, a constant, leafy companion through the aches and anxieties of medieval and Renaissance life. The scent, once just cabbage, now carries a hint of something more, a whisper of ancient remedies and the enduring human hope for healing. Right. So after our little detour into the, shall we say, aromatic world of ancient preservation techniques, you find our humble cabbage really starting to spread its leaves, so to speak, across the European continent. It's no longer just a Mediterranean specialty. It's becoming a staple. And with that ubiquity comes a whole new pharmacopoeia, a veritable cabbage copia of medicinal uses. You're now venturing into a landscape where the chill in the air feels a bit more biting, the forests a little deeper, and the remedies perhaps a touch more robust. Imagine you're wandering through the misty, verdant lands of the Celts. The air is damp, carrying the scent of woodsmoke and wet earth. Here, cabbage isn't just something you might find bubbling in a pot, though it certainly was that too. For the Celtic healers, those often enigmatic figures we picture with their herbs, and perhaps a knowing glance, cabbage was a go-to for a surprising array of ailments. You see them carefully selecting the largest, freshest leaves. These aren't destined for a salad, not yet anyway. Instead, they're often bruised, just slightly, to release their potent juices. You might see a warrior nursing a nasty gash from a skirmish, or perhaps just an unfortunate encounter with a particularly aggressive bramble bush. A cool, crushed cabbage leaf, acting as a natural poultice, is applied directly to the wound. The idea is to draw out inflammation, to soothe the angry redness. And you know, it's not entirely far-fetched. We talked about those sulfur compounds earlier, and they do have anti-inflammatory properties. They wouldn't have known the precise biochemistry, of course, but generations of observation would have told them this green stuff helps. It wasn't just for battle scars. Think of swollen joints, the kind of ache that settles deep in the bones after a long day of, well, whatever kept Celts busy. Perhaps a bit too much enthusiastic dancing at a festival. Again, the cabbage leaf compress comes into play, cool and calming. You might see it bound with a strip of linen, looking surprisingly neat. There's a certain practical magic to it, this use of something so common, so readily available, for internal complaints, especially those of the digestive system. Cabbage, likely boiled or made into a simple broth, was also on the menu. Remember how Cato the Elder swore by it for everything? Well, the Celts seem to have picked up on its digestive benefits too, perhaps without quite the same level of obsessive documentation. They might not have written lengthy treatises, but the knowledge was passed down, mother to daughter, healer to apprentice, in the rustle of the leaves themselves. One particularly interesting, though perhaps less substantiated, idea is that cabbage leaves were sometimes used in rituals, not just for their physical healing properties, but also for a kind of spiritual cleansing. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or localized folk beliefs, but the strong, almost pungent nature of cabbage could easily lend itself to notions of purification. Now, let you drift eastward, across the vast plains and into the heartlands of the Slavic peoples. Here, cabbage, or kapusta, as you'll hear it called with a certain reverence, takes on an almost legendary status. If you thought the Celts were fond of it, you're about to witness a whole new level of cruciferous devotion. You walk into a village, and the air is thick with a different cabbage aroma. Sharp, tangy, a little bit funky. This is the scent of fermentation, of sauerkraut, or kwaszenia kapusta. Saying, this isn't just food. It's medicine, a preventative, a cure-all. For centuries, long before anyone knew what vitamin C was, Slavic communities understood that this fermented marvel kept scurvy at bay during the long, harsh winters when fresh greens were a distant memory. You see barrels of it bubbling away, a testament to their ingenuity. The applications here are incredibly diverse. Cabbage juice, often the brine from the sauerkraut, was a prized remedy. You might see someone taking a swig for a persistent cough, or to settle an upset stomach. It's potent stuff, not exactly your morning orange juice, but believed to be incredibly effective. The mainstream historical fact here is that the high vitamin C content in sauerkraut was indeed a lifesaver for populations with limited access to fresh produce, especially sailors and those in colder climates, long before the science was understood. For external uses, much like the Celts, poultices of fresh or even slightly fermented cabbage leaves were applied to wounds, burns, and bruises. Imagine the soothing coolness of a cabbage leaf on a fevered brow. They also used it for headaches, sometimes placing leaves on the temples. It's this idea of drawing out the bad humors or the heat, a concept that, in various forms, you find across many traditional medical systems. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit from some Slavic traditions involves using cabbage leaves to predict the weather or even futures, though this veers more into folklore than strict medicine, but it shows how deeply embedded the plant was in the cultural psyche. Sometimes, specific incantations or rituals would accompany the preparation of cabbage-based remedies, believing it enhanced their power. Perhaps a grandmother muttering ancient words as she shreds the cabbage for fermentation, ensuring its healing properties are at their peak. It wasn't just about the physical components. There was an energy, a belief system woven into its use. They also made hearty cabbage soups, of course, which were considered deeply nourishing and restorative, especially for those recovering from illness. It's comfort food with a medicinal pedigree. You can almost smell that rich, savory broth simmering, a promise of warmth and healing. And it wasn't just these two major cultural blocks. Across Europe, from the Germanic tribes who also had a strong tradition of sauerkraut, to southern regions where Roman influences lingered, cabbage held its ground as a versatile folk medicine. It was used to treat gout, with leaves wrapped around afflicted joints. It was even, rather optimistically, suggested as a cure for baldness in some old texts, though I suspect the success rate on that one was, shall we say, limited. It makes you wonder how many shiny pâtés were hopefully slathered with cabbage paste. It was also a well-known remedy for hangovers, eaten raw or juiced. Perhaps its hydrating qualities and nutrient density helped. Or maybe it was just a sufficiently earthy distraction from the pounding in your head. Of course, if the cabbage remedy didn't quite fix your ailment, you could always make a hearty stew. Waste not, want not. Especially when you're dealing with something as fundamentally useful as a head of cabbage. It's this blend of the practical and the hopeful, the observed effect and the traditional belief, that makes the story of cabbage medicine so fascinating. You see a common thread: cabbage is cooling, it's cleansing, it's nourishing. The specific applications might vary. A unique Slavic fermentation here, a particular Celtic poultice method there. But the underlying trust in this humble vegetable is a constant you find across the diverse cultures of old Europe. It's a far cry from our modern, sterile blister packs, but there's a certain charm to reaching for a remedy that grows right there in your garden, isn't there? And so, after considering how this humble plant sustained populations, like we touched upon with those surprisingly robust peasant diets, you find it's not just about filling bellies. Oh no, the cabbage has another, rather persistent role in the grand theater of human belief. It's a healer of the skin. You're now venturing into a world where a simple leaf, cool and crisp from the garden, is seen as a powerful balm for all manner of oes. Imagine you've taken a tumble, perhaps scraped your knee while foraging for slightly more exotic herbs. Or maybe you've touched a hot pan with a moment's distraction, thinking about, well, probably cabbage. Instead of reaching for a modern antiseptic wipe, your historical counterpart reaches for the cabbage patch. You see, the methods were often beautifully straightforward. The most common approach, the cabbage leaf poultice, you'd select a good, broad outer leaf, one that's still vibrant and pliable. Sometimes you gently warm it, perhaps by dipping it in hot water or holding it near a flame for just a moment, just enough to make it supple and release its essence. Then you might bruise it slightly, or even crush it between two stones, or with a pestle if you're feeling fancy. You can almost feel that satisfying, soft crunch. Can't you? This wasn't just rough handling. It was believed to activate the healing properties, to encourage the leaf to share its virtues. This slightly mangled, perhaps slightly warmed leaf would then be applied directly to the wound, the burn, the rash, that patch of irritated skin that's been driving you quietly mad. It would be held in place with a strip of linen or whatever cloth was at hand. There you are, sporting a fashionable green bandage, feeling the cool, damp embrace of the cabbage against your skin. It wasn't always so elaborate. Sometimes, especially for minor afflictions, a whole, clean leaf might just be laid upon the skin. A simple, verdant compress. You can picture it, the waxy surface of the leaf, cool to the touch, providing immediate, if temporary, relief. And then there was cabbage juice. Yes, the liquid extracted from crushed leaves, sometimes diluted, sometimes applied neat, dabbed onto sores, or used as a wash. It's not too far a leap from some of the green juices people pay a small fortune for today. Though the intention here was purely topical, they probably weren't blending it with kale and ginger for a morning pick-me-up. Or were they, that's a thought for another sleepy evening. Now, why did they believe so fervently in this leafy remedy? The understanding, or perhaps the misunderstanding, of its effects is quite fascinating. A primary factor was undoubtedly the immediate sensory experience. Imagine the feel of that cool, moist leaf on a hot, inflamed burn. It's instantly soothing, isn't it? That sensation of cooling relief is very real. For a burn, this would feel like a blessing, reducing that throbbing heat. For an itchy rash, the coolness could calm the irritation. It's the same principle behind why you might run a burn under cold water or apply a cold compress today. The cabbage leaf was nature's own little cold pack, readily available and refreshingly damp. Beyond the simple cooling effect, there was often a deeper belief at play, the idea that the cabbage was actively drawing out the ailment. You might hear whispers that the leaf possessed a power to pull the fire from a burn, or the bad humors from an infected wound, or the poison from an insect bite. You can almost see them, anxiously watching the applied leaf, hoping to see it wilt or change color, taking that as a sign that the cabbage was heroically absorbing all the nastiness. If the leaf turned a bit slimy and, shall we say, fragrant after a few hours on a wound, well, that was just proof it had done its job valiantly, sacrificing itself to draw out the malevolence. Good job, cabbage, you might murmur. You've taken one for the team. This wasn't just some fringe idea. The belief in cabbage's wound-healing prowess is ancient. Remember Cato the Elder, our Roman agriculturalist and statesman we mentioned. the one who was practically the president of the cabbage fan club. He was a huge proponent of cabbage for external applications. He wrote quite extensively that cabbage could cleanse all sorts of sores and wounds, and even suggested it for dislocations and swellings. His works were hugely influential, and his pronouncements on cabbage certainly helped cement its place in the pharmacopoeia of the ancient world and beyond. This is one of those mainstream historical facts that just keeps on giving, or, in this case, keeps on healing. Allegedly. And this belief wasn't confined to antiquity. It persisted through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and well into the 19th and even early 20th centuries in folk medicine. Your great-grandmother might have had a cabbage leaf remedy for a blister or a swollen joint. It was accessible, cheap, and part of a long tradition of plant-based healing. When a trained physician was miles away or too expensive, the garden often provided the first line of defense. Here's a slightly more obscure tidbit. For you, some folklore traditions suggested that specific types of cabbage, or even leaves picked at a certain phase of the moon, were more potent, and sometimes the veins of the cabbage leaf were seen as significant. It was thought that if the pattern of veins on the leaf resembled, say, the network of veins in an inflamed limb, it would be particularly effective. Sympathetic magic, you see, where like is thought to influence like. Historians still argue whether the remarkable persistence of cabbage as a wound treatment was due to some genuinely active, albeit mild, anti-inflammatory compounds within the leaves, or if its efficacy was primarily a result of the placebo effect, amplified by the comforting ritual of care and the deeply ingrained cultural belief in its power. Modern science, if it were to squint really hard, might offer a few tentative nods. Cabbage does contain compounds like glucosinolates, which have some anti-inflammatory properties, as well as vitamins C and K, which are important for skin health and healing. Its high water content, as we've noted, definitely provides that cooling, soothing effect. So, perhaps it wasn't entirely wishful thinking. The understanding of why it might have helped was certainly different from ours, but the observation that it sometimes seemed to help might not have been completely off the mark. Of course, you wouldn't want to slap a cabbage leaf on a serious third-degree burn and call it a day, please. Don't try this at home instead of proper medical care. We're just appreciating the historical view here, perhaps with a dash of gentle amusement. Think of it as the ultimate organic, biodegradable Band-Aid, but with slightly more ambition. So, you can just picture it, a world dotted with people patiently applying these green, leafy plasters. The faint, earthy, slightly sulfurous scent of cabbage mingling with the aroma of woodsmoke or damp earth. The quiet hope that this simple vegetable, this food of the people, held the secret to mending their skin, to easing their pain. It's a testament to human ingenuity and our enduring relationship with the plants around us, always seeking comfort and healing from the green world. Even if the mechanisms were a little leafy, you feel the coolness, the strange vegetable embrace, and perhaps, just perhaps, a tiny bit better. All right, so after all those grand tales of cabbage on the battlefield, and yes, even its surprising role in ancient fashion, remember those vibrant hues we talked about? You might be bracing yourself for this next part. We're journeying inwards now, into the very core of your being, or at least the parts responsible for processing your lunch. We're talking about digestive comfort, and cabbage's rather some aromatic reputation in that department. You know the feeling. You've enjoyed a hearty meal, perhaps with a generous helping of coleslaw or some beautifully braised red cabbage. And then, a few hours later, your internal plumbing starts to, well, let's just say it begins to conduct its own little symphony. Cabbage, for many, is the lead trumpeter in your gut's personal brass band, announcing its passage with a certain unmissable fanfare. It's a vegetable that doesn't exactly tiptoe through your digestive tract. But despite this modern-day association with, let's call it, enthusiastic digestion, cabbage has a long and rather distinguished history as a soother of troubled tummies. You see, long before we had little chewable tablets in pastel colors, people turned to what grew in their gardens, and cabbage was often a first responder for all sorts of internal commotions. Let's start with something many of us can relate to, that feeling of being stuck, constipation. Today, you understand it's likely a lack of fiber, a need for more hydration. You munch on some raw cabbage, perhaps in a salad, and you appreciate that satisfying crunch, that fibrous bulk which, you know, will gently encourage things along. It's a mechanical process, a gentle sweeping of the internal corridors. But how did our ancestors see it? Well, if your system was sluggish, according to the humoral theories we've touched upon, it might have been seen as an imbalance. Perhaps your gut was too dry or too cold and stagnant. Cabbage, often classified as having cold and sometimes drying properties, or occasionally moistening, depending on the specific school of thought and preparation, would be administered to counteract the perceived imbalance. They might not have used the word fiber, but they observed that something in cabbage helped to move things along. It's fascinating, isn't it? How they arrived at similar solutions, even if their explanations sound a world away from our own biochemical understanding. Then there's the more serious matter of ulcers, those gnawing, burning pains in the stomach. Today, we know about H. pylori, about excess acid, and we even know about a rather unsung hero found in cabbage juice called S-methylmethionine, sometimes dubbed vitamin U. It's not a vitamin in the classic sense, but this compound has shown some remarkable properties in protecting the stomach lining and promoting the healing of ulcers. You can almost imagine it. A soothing balm coating those irritated spots? A quiet hero? Vitamin U? Not as flashy as C or D, but doing crucial work in the shadows of your stomach. But rewind a few centuries, or even a couple of millennia, an ulcer wouldn't be called an ulcer. It would be an inflammation, perhaps an excess of choler or yellow bile, making the stomach too hot and fiery. And what would you use to cool down that internal fire? Something cooling. Of course, enter cabbage, often seen as a cold vegetable. Consuming cabbage, perhaps as a juice or lightly cooked, was believed to temper that fiery humor, to bring the system back into a state of calm, cool equilibrium. They were, in a way, on the right track, even if the map they were using was drawn with humors instead of molecules. This brings us deeper into that complex world of humoral theory, which, as you'll recall, was the bedrock of Western medicine for centuries. This wasn't just a quirky fad. Figures like Galen, the prominent Roman physician whose medical doctrines profoundly influenced Western medicine for over 300 years, meticulously categorized foods and herbs by their supposed humoral qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and their effects on the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your digestion, like every other bodily process, was a delicate dance of these humors. Too much heat in the stomach, that's excess yellow bile. Too much dampness and cold leading to poor digestion. An overabundance of phlegm. Cabbage, generally, was considered by many to be cold and dry. So, if your digestive complaint was diagnosed as being caused by an excess of heat and moisture, say, a gurgling, upset stomach with perhaps some diarrhea, which they might attribute to an overproduction of phlegm or an agitated, hot bowel, cabbage could be prescribed to dry things out and cool things down. You can almost picture the ancient physician stroking their beard, nodding sagely as they prescribe a nice, cooling cabbage broth. Now, about that. Wind. The very effect that makes some people shy away from cabbage today. You have to wonder what ancient and medieval physicians made of it. Did they just discreetly open a window and blame it on the dog? If dogs were allowed in sick rooms? Probably not. It's more likely they incorporated it into their theories. Historians still argue whether the pronounced flatulence sometimes associated with cabbage consumption was viewed in humoral terms as a beneficial expulsion of corrupt airs or trapped vapors from the gut, or merely an unfortunate side effect. Perhaps sometimes it was seen as a sign that the cabbage was working, vigorously clearing out blockages or dispelling stagnant humors. Ah, good, the physician might say. The noxious winds are being expelled. One person's social embarrassment is another sign of humoral realignment, I suppose. And speaking of enthusiastic proponents, Cato the Elder, that Roman statesman we've mentioned before for his almost fanatical devotion to cabbage, believed it was a panacea for digestive ailments. He wasn't just talking about a bit of indigestion. He thought cabbage could prevent hangovers if eaten before drinking, and even suggested it could purge the body of ill humors. One of his more earthy recommendations, and a truly quirky historical tidbit, was his assertion that if you urinated on the spot where you intended to plant your cabbage, it would grow better and absorb some of your own essence, thereby becoming even more beneficial to your health. I'm not sure modern organic farming standards would quite approve of that particular fertilization technique, but it certainly shows the extent of his belief in the vegetable's power. It makes you wonder if his guests ever politely declined his cabbage salad. So, you see, the relationship between cabbage and your digestive system is a long and storied one, full of surprising insights and, let's be honest, a few misunderstandings based on the prevailing theories of the time. They might not have known about glucosinolates or the intricacies of the gut microbiome, but they observed, they theorized, and they used what nature provided. They saw cabbage not just as food, but as medicine, a tool to rebalance the delicate inner workings of the body, even if their understanding of how it worked was filtered through the lens of those ancient humors. It's a testament to cabbage's persistent utility that even as scientific understanding evolved, its reputation as a friend to the gut, albeit sometimes a boisterous one, has endured. You just have to appreciate its direct approach. So, you see, it wasn't just about filling bellies or, as we touched upon earlier, potentially warding off less than pleasant digestive symphonies. The humble cabbage, that unassuming sphere of tightly packed leaves, held a prominent place in the historical medicine cabinet, particularly for what it could do on the outside of your body. You're now venturing into the world of cabbage as a topical treatment, a soothing balm, a verdant compress for all sorts of aches and pains. Imagine, for a moment, you're back in a time when a well-stocked pharmacy meant a well-tended garden. Let's talk about joint pain. Picture an old Roman legionary, miles clocked on his sandals, his knees groaning with every step on those famously straight roads. Or perhaps you see a medieval farmer, hands gnarled like ancient tree roots from years of toiling in the fields, the damp chill of the morning seeping into their very bones. What relief could they find? Well, they might turn to the cabbage patch. You'd select a large, pliable outer leaf, wouldn't you? Feel its surprising coolness, its waxy, smooth surface. To truly unlock its soothing potential, you might gently bruise it, perhaps with a smooth, heavy stone or the back of a wooden spoon, just enough to start releasing its natural juices, that faint, earthy, slightly sulfurous scent rising to meet you. Then, you'd carefully wrap this leaf, or several of them, around the aching joint, a swollen knee, a tender elbow, those sore knuckles. You'd secure it with a strip of linen, a piece of old cloth, whatever was at hand, and you'd feel that initial coolness, a welcome sensation against inflamed skin. It's a sensation that speaks directly to the ache, a gentle, natural counterpressure. Cato the Elder, that rather stern Roman statesman we've encountered before in other contexts, was a huge proponent of cabbage for pretty much everything. His writings in De Agricultura don't just praise it as food. He details its use for dressing wounds and reducing swellings. He was convinced, truly convinced, that cabbage could cleanse and heal. You can almost hear him now, can't you? Lecturing some poor unfortunate on the precise method of application, probably with a few pronouncements on moral fortitude thrown in for good measure. Now, this practice wasn't just for creaky joints. One of the most persistent folk uses of cabbage leaves, one that whispers down through generations of women, is for easing the discomfort of mastitis. If you're a new mother, you might already know this one, as it's a remedy that's still shared today. You take those cool, cupped leaves and place them directly inside the bra, against the tender, inflamed breast. The shape of the leaf often conforms surprisingly well, providing a gentle, cooling embrace. The relief, as described by countless women throughout history, is said to be significant. It's a quiet, personal form of healing, passed from mother to daughter, midwife to patient. There's a beautiful simplicity to it. Isn't there, using something so common, so readily available to soothe such a specific and often distressing condition? You can imagine the hushed tones in a dimly lit room, the gentle rustle of the leaves, the soft sigh of relief. And then, of course, there are bruises. We've all had them, those spectacular, technicolor badges of clumsiness. You walk into a table, you take a tumble. Historically, before arnica cream became a staple in your first aid kit, a cabbage leaf poultice was a go-to. Again, the process would be similar. Bruise the leaf, apply it to the affected area. The idea was that the cabbage would help to draw out the soreness, reduce the swelling, and perhaps even hasten the fading of that impressive purple-blue-green mottling. It's easy to dismiss these old ways, but imagine the comfort of doing something, of applying a cool, natural remedy when options were limited. It wasn't just about the physical. It was about the act of care, the ritual of healing. Now, for a slightly more unusual, or perhaps, let's say, aromatics aspect. A quirky little tidbit is that some folk traditions held that cabbage leaves applied to the feet could draw out fevers or toxins from the body. You'd essentially make cabbage socks. Imagine, if you will, tucking yourself into bed, your feet swaddled in greenery. The next morning, the theory went, the leaves would be wilted and discolored, having supposedly absorbed the illness. Whether it was the cabbage doing the heavy lifting, or just a good night's rest and very breathable, albeit slightly fragrant. Footwear is, well, up for debate. Probably not the height of fashion, even then. But if it made you feel better, who are we to judge your verdant foot mittens? The fascinating thing is that these practices weren't just random shots in the dark. Cabbage contains various compounds, including glucosinolates, which can break down into isothiocyanates, substances that modern science has indeed found to have anti-inflammatory properties. Of course, the concentrations and their ability to penetrate the skin effectively from a whole leaf are subjects of ongoing discussion. This leads us to one of those wonderful scholarly debates. Historians still argue whether the widespread historical reliance on cabbage poultices for pain and inflammation was primarily due to the actual biochemical properties of the plant, the significant psychological comfort of the placebo effect, or simply the beneficial counter-irritant effect of a cool, moist application. It's likely a blend of all three. Don't you think the mind is a powerful thing? And the sensation of coolness on a hot, swollen area is undeniably soothing. regardless of complex chemical interactions. You can almost picture a village healer, their hands stained faintly green, carefully selecting the best leaves, their reputation built on the tangible relief they could offer with such simple means. It's a far cry from our sterile packaged pills and creams, but there's a directness, an earthiness to it that resonates. You're not just passively taking something, you're actively engaging with a piece of the natural world, transforming it into a tool for your own comfort. And while you might not be rushing to wrap your sprained ankle in a cabbage leaf tonight, though, who knows? Maybe you're now cabbage curious. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes the answers, or at least some measure of comfort, have been rustling in the garden all along. It makes you wonder what other simple secrets are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for us to remember them. Perhaps the biggest takeaway is not to underestimate the wisdom, or at least the hopeful ingenuity, of those who came before us. Armed with little more than what the earth provided and a desire to ease suffering, it certainly puts a new spin on grocery shopping, doesn't it? Next time you're in the produce aisle, you might just look at that head of cabbage with a little more respect, a little more therapeutic intrigue. Now, after considering cabbage in its more, shall we say, dignified roles, a staple for soldiers, a soother of common wounds, like we touched upon with those battlefield applications, you might think you've got the full measure of this leafy marvel, but you'd be gently mistaken. You see, cabbage, much like that one friend who's brilliant at their day job, but also passionately believes they can communicate with squirrels, has a delightfully eccentric side. We're tiptoeing now, softly, into the world of its quirkier applications. These are the uses that make you tilt your head, maybe raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, and whisper, "Really cabbage for biggie that and asked neder." First up on our tour of peculiar panaceas is the age-old lament baldness. Yes, you heard that right. Before minoxidil, before toupees that looked suspiciously like small furry creatures, there was cabbage. You can almost picture it, can't you? Some hopeful soul, perhaps a Roman senator worried about his thinning pate, meticulously mashing cabbage leaves into a pungent green pulp. This fragrant concoction would then be applied, with varying degrees of optimism, directly to the scalp. You can imagine the sensation: cool, a bit slimy, and overwhelmingly cabbagey. The idea, one supposes, was that the inherent vitality of this robust plant, its sheer will to grow, could somehow be transferred to those dormant hair follicles. Modern science might, offer a skeptical cough at this juncture. But for centuries, this was a genuine hope. It's a testament to how deeply people longed for a full head of hair, willing to endure what must have been a rather unique personal aroma. You'd certainly make an impression at the local toga party. Is that eau de brassica you're wearing? Darling, or are you just cultivating a new du Gepniers? The ancient physician, Cato the Elder, whose fondness for cabbage we've noted before, was a proponent of its many virtues, though it's less clear if he specifically touted it for hair growth against other ailments. Still, the general reverence for its power certainly laid the groundwork for such hopeful applications, fostering a belief that if cabbage could sustain armies, surely it could sustain a hairline. Then, you find yourself confronting the stubborn, unwelcome guest, the wart, those little bumps that appear as if by some mischievous magic, clinging on with surprising tenacity. Today, you might reach for an over-the-counter freezing spray or a salicylic acid patch, engaging in a small clinical battle. But back then, you guessed it, cabbage, to the rescue, in a way that feels more like a gentle, green whisper of folk wisdom. One common method involved rubbing a freshly cut cabbage leaf onto the wart, You can almost feel the slightly rough, cool dampness of the leaf against your skin. A strange, earthy prescription. Sometimes, the ritual didn't stop there. You might then be instructed to bury that specific piece of cabbage under a particular phase of the moon, or perhaps in a secret place where no one would find it. The logic, as far as you can piece it together, seems to be a form of sympathetic magic, as the cabbage leaf rotted away unseen in the quiet earth. So too would the wart wither and vanish from your skin, almost as if the ground itself was drawing the blemish away. Historians still argue whether the perceived efficacy of these wart cures was due to any inherent antiviral property of the cabbage, or if it was the powerful combination of the placebo effect, the focused ritual, and the body's own immune system eventually triumphing over the nuisance. It's fascinating, isn't it? The deep-seated belief that this common garden vegetable held the subtle secret to unblemishing your skin. Some sources even suggest specific types of cabbage, or leaves picked at certain times of day, for maximum wart-vanishing power. A quirky little tidbit suggesting a whole folk pharmacopoeia, whispered from one generation to the next, built around this one unassuming plant. Now, let's lean in a little closer, because this next one is particularly unexpected, even by the standards we're exploring. Hearing loss. Imagine the quiet dread of the world slowly dimming its sounds, the vibrant symphony of daily life fading, the voices of loved ones becoming faint, distant whispers. In a time before sophisticated audiology, before tiny, powerful hearing aids, what could you possibly do when silence began to creep in? Well, some ancient healers proposed, with utmost seriousness, cabbage. Not to eat, necessarily. In this instance, but as a direct, topical application. You might encounter recipes for cabbage juice, carefully expressed from the crisp, veined leaves, to be gently dripped into the ear canal, or perhaps a warmed cabbage leaf, softened and pliable by steam or gentle heat, to be placed over the ear like a green, leafy earmuff, a comforting, if unusual, compress. You try to picture the sensation, the slightly ticklish, cool trickle of juice, a surprising feeling in such a delicate place, or the vegetal warmth of the leaf against your skin, muffling the already fading sounds. Further, ironically, the theory behind it is, shall we say, wonderfully elusive to our modern understanding. Perhaps the natural drawing properties attributed to cabbage for wounds and swellings, like those poultices we discussed earlier for more visible afflictions, were thought to extend to drawing out whatever unseen blockage or ailment was impairing the hearing. Or maybe, and this is pure speculation offered with a gentle, sleepy smile, the sheer surprise of having cabbage juice squirted in your ear was thought to shock the auditory system back into full, vibrant action. Can you hear me now? One might hopefully ask. The reply, perhaps muffled, no, but my ear smells wonderfully of coleslaw. And this is certainly a lesser-known application, and one that truly highlights the sheer desperation and boundless creativity employed to find remedies for such profoundly debilitating conditions. And finally, we arrive at a truly timeless affliction, one that has plagued humanity since the very first, slightly too enthusiastic overindulgence in fermented grape juice or frothy barley brew, the dreaded hangover. Yes, even for this entirely self-inflicted misery, cabbage was presented as a noble champion, a green knight ready to battle the throbbing headache and queasy stomach. You wake up, your head feeling like a particularly enthusiastic blacksmith is using it for anvil practice, your mouth tasting like the forgotten corner of a dusty attic. What's the ancient solution? Not a greasy breakfast burrito or a suspiciously fizzy concoction of raw egg and Worcestershire sauce, but good old, unassuming cabbage. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder a man whose encyclopedic writings suggest he had an opinion on almost everything under the Mediterranean sun, was a staunch advocate. He suggested eating raw cabbage before a night of heavy drinking to prevent intoxication, a sort of preemptive strike, and then again the next morning to cure the inevitable, unpleasant repercussions. You can just imagine him, perhaps at a symposium, wagging a slightly censorious finger. A few leaves of this, my friend, before the wine flows too freely, and you'll be fit to debate philosophy, or at least stand upright, by noon. The idea of crunching through raw, pungent cabbage leaves when your stomach is already performing delicate, unhappy acrobatic feats. Well, it's a brave choice, a testament to true suffering. Perhaps the sheer fibrous jolt to the system was part of the intended cure, or maybe its high vitamin content. Something we recognize today for its restorative properties genuinely did offer some tangible benefits. Some ancient recipes even involved cabbage soaked in vinegar, which sounds particularly bracing, to say the least. This practice of using cabbage for hangovers is a fascinating mainstream historical fact, repeated across various classical texts, showing just how long we've been searching for that magic morning after fix. It makes you wonder if our modern superfood sea smoothie, packed with kale and spinach, isn't just a distant, more palatable, and arguably more Instagrammable descendant of Pliny's raw cabbage prescription. So you see, from the top of your potentially balding head to the tips of your warty fingers, and even into the delicate, echoing recesses of your ears, cabbage was there. It wasn't just food, not just a simple poultice for a soldier's scrape. It was a horticultural hero, a veritable Swiss Army leaf, ready to tackle an astonishing breadth of ailments with a surprising degree of confidence. If it grew in the garden and you had a problem, however peculiar, there was a decent chance someone, somewhere at some point in history, had tried to fix it with cabbage. It's a bit comical, perhaps, when viewed through our modern, scientifically informed lens, but it also speaks to a profound, almost reverent connection with the natural world, a deeply ingrained belief that remedies were all around us, hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be discovered in the most unassuming of plants. Like we've seen with its journey from a wild, bitter ancestor to a cultivated staple across continents, the story of cabbage is one of surprising versatility and enduring human hope, a testament to our relentless quest for health and well-being, even if it meant smelling faintly of a vegetable patch. So, we've spent a good deal of time pottering around European gardens and apothecaries, haven't we? You've patiently listened as we've peeked over the shoulders of Greek physicians and Roman agronomists, watching them peer at cabbage leaves like they held the secrets of the universe. Which, to be fair, for some ailments, they kind of did. Remember how Cato the Elder was practically a cabbage cult leader, with his exhaustive lists of its virtues? It's enough to make you want to build a tiny shrine to a head of Savoy. But what about the rest of the world? Did this humble brassica, our leafy green friend, our sometimes gassy companion, get a similar VIP medicinal treatment elsewhere? Or was Europe having its own exclusive and slightly pungent cabbage party, complete with togas and excessive wine? Let's allow our minds to drift eastwards. Shall we further than the Black Sea, beyond the lands where Alexander's armies marched? We're heading towards Asia, a vast continent humming with its own ancient and incredibly sophisticated traditions of medicine. You can almost smell the subtle blend of incense, drying herbs, and something earthy, perhaps a simmering decoction. As you step into this thought space, imagine ancient China. For a moment, picture the bustling markets, the serene temples, the quiet rooms where scholars and physicians meticulously documented the properties of thousands of plants. Now, while specific mentions of cabbage, Brassica oleracea as the Romans knew it, or its close cousins like bok choy or napa cabbage, which are Brassica rapa, madage, as a standalone superstar in the grand theater of traditional Chinese medicine, might be a little more reserved in the earliest, most revered texts compared to, say, ginseng or ginger. It certainly wasn't lurking in the shadows, completely ignored. It's a mainstream historical fact that various forms of cabbage, including loose-leafed varieties, were cultivated in China well over 2,000 years ago, predating some of the more structured European accounts we've examined. These weren't just for stir-fries, though one imagines they made a delightful addition. In Chinese dietary therapy, which is so beautifully intertwined with medicine that it's hard to see where one ends and the other begins, foods are often chosen for their energetic properties. Cabbage, particularly varieties like napa, is often considered to have cooling properties, beneficial for clearing heat from the body, aiding digestion, and promoting urination. So if you were feeling a bit hot and bothered internally, a dish featuring cabbage might be just what the doctor, or perhaps the wise village elder, ordered. It wasn't necessarily about grinding it into a poultice with the same theatrical flair as some of our European friends, but its role in maintaining balance and health was quietly acknowledged. Then, if you let your thoughts drift further south, towards the Indian subcontinent, the ancient wisdom of Ayurveda whispers through the ages. Cabbage, or kramuka, as it might be referred to in some older Sanskrit texts, though specific botanical identifications across ancient languages are always a delightful puzzle for scholars, finds its place here too. Much like in Chinese thought, and indeed echoing the humoral theories we touched upon in Europe, remember that delicate balance of bodily fluids. Ayurveda considers the effect of foods on the doshas, vata kabhi, pitta, and kapha. Different types of cabbage, prepared in different ways, would be thought to influence these energies. Generally, it might be seen as having qualities that could aggravate vata if eaten raw in large quantities, perhaps due to its, shall we say, wind-producing nature. Ahem. But when cooked, especially with warming spices, it could be quite balancing, particularly for pitta and kapha. Its use for detoxification, or as a gentle cleanser for the digestive system, resonates with some of the European ideas we've explored. Now, this is where the plot, like a good cabbage soup, thickens. You have these incredible networks, the legendary Silk Road snaking like a dusty ribbon across mountains and deserts, and maritime routes where ships, guided by the monsoon winds, connected the Roman Empire with India and onwards to Southeast Asia and China. It's wonderfully romantic, isn't it? To imagine merchants bundled in furs or light cottons, not just trading precious silks, fragrant spices, and gleaming jewels, but also, perhaps tucked away in their baggage, seeds of unfamiliar plants or scraps of knowledge about remedies. You can almost hear a whispered exchange in a bustling port city. Psst, psst. Friend, got some of that eastern cabbage my cousin in Antioch swears by it for his gout. Or perhaps, this Roman fellow told me they use the leaves for wounds. Interesting. The transmission of agricultural products is well documented. Seeds for new crops certainly traveled. But medicinal ideas, especially for something as commonplace as a cabbage, that's a trickier path to trace. This leads us to the other fascinating possibility: independent discovery, or perhaps parallel development. It's not like they had a global cabbage conference call back then, moderated by Pliny the Elder via carrier pigeon, complete with PowerPoint slides on papyrus. So, did different cultures, separated by vast oceans and towering mountain ranges, simply look at this hardy, adaptable plant, this unassuming leafy sphere, and through generations of observation, trial, and error, arrive at remarkably similar conclusions about its benefits? You see a plant, that grows readily in diverse climates, that fills the belly and provides sustenance. It's only natural that you'd start to notice other effects. If you apply a crushed cabbage leaf to a minor burn and it feels soothing, or if you eat it and your digestion feels a bit better, that knowledge gets passed down. The perceived properties, its cooling nature, its ability to soothe inflammation, its digestive support, these are things that could be observed by anyone, anywhere, who was paying attention. And this is where, as you might expect, the scholarly debates begin. Historians still argue whether the striking similarities in cabbage remedies, like its application as a poultice for skin afflictions, or its reputation as a digestive aid across such disparate cultures, point to ancient global networks of knowledge slowly diffusing these ideas, or simply to the plant's inherent, observable benefits leading to parallel innovation. It's a classic chicken or the cabbage seed scenario. Was it shared wisdom, or a case of great minds eat alike? And for a quirky little tidbit that adds another layer to this leafy enigma in some folk traditions, stretching from parts of Eastern Europe into Asia, there are whispers of cabbage leaves being used not just for the body, but to spiritually cleanse a space, or even to ward off bad luck or negative energies from a dwelling. Imagine, for a moment, someone carefully placing a cabbage leaf in the corner of a room, not for a snack, but like a fuzzy green dream catcher. It's probably not as aromatically pleasing as a smudge stick after a few days. Mind you, I suspect the flies might become quite devoted followers. But if it brings peace of mind, who are we to judge? It just goes to show that the human relationship with plants, especially one as fundamental as cabbage, can weave its way into every aspect of life, from the profoundly medicinal to the subtly mystical. So, was it a case of convergent evolution of ideas? Or did some ancient influencer, a forgotten cabbage connoisseur, manage to spread the leafy gospel far and wide the historical record, much like a dense head of red cabbage, holds its secrets tightly? So, after all those rather inventive applications we've explored, from those Roman hangover strategies we delved into, to the, shall we say, optimistic medieval belief in cabbage for everything from a twisted ankle to a lingering cough, remember that rather comprehensive list from a few sections back. You might just be sitting there, perhaps with a warm drink cradled in your hands, simply wondering, why? Why this unassuming, humble vegetable? Why did the cabbage of all things become such a ubiquitous, almost legendary figure in the grand, unfolding drama of historical home remedies? Well, you can probably guess one of the biggest reasons. Just close your eyes for a moment and picture it you're living in. Oh, let's say rural England, sometime in the 14th century, or perhaps ancient Gaul, or even a small village nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, much, much later. What's one plant you're almost guaranteed to see, thriving with a sort of cheerful leafy stubbornness? That's right, good old cabbage. It's just there. You don't need a fancy greenhouse or exotic soils imported from distant lands. Cabbage is wonderfully, beautifully unfussy. It grows in cool weather, it tolerates less than perfect soil, and it produces a rather satisfying amount of, well, cabbage. You see it in the king's expansive kitchen gardens. Sure, but more importantly, you see it in the tiny patch behind the peasant's cottage, its broad leaves collecting the morning dew. This incredible accessibility, this sheer, unadulterated presence, is undoubtedly a cornerstone of its medicinal reign. When you're feeling unwell, and the nearest town with an apothecary is a day's walk away, and his prices are, shall we say, aspirational, you turn to what's at hand. And cabbage, bless its fibrous heart, was almost always at hand. You didn't need a special writ from the local lord to harvest it from your own garden. It was yours, dependable, like an old, slightly lumpy green cushion. And then, of course, there's the matter of coin, or lack thereof. Cabbage wasn't just accessible, it was, to put it mildly, cheap. We're talking about a food, a potential remedy, that was within reach of virtually everyone, from the lowest serf to the middling artisan. You could probably trade a few eggs for a hefty head of it, or grow enough in a small plot to see your family through many a minor ailment, or at least many an attempted cure. Think about the alternatives, those exotic spices we mentioned earlier, like cinnamon or cloves, often lauded for their own, sometimes genuine, medicinal properties. They cost a king's ransom, traversing dangerous trade routes, potions from an alchemist or a learned physician. Forget about it, unless you happen to be nobility. Cabbage, however, was the people's remedy. It was the budget-friendly DIY healthcare of its time. You didn't need to save up for months to afford a cabbage poultice. It was the historical equivalent of finding a really good coupon for that generic brand cough syrup. Not glamorous and perhaps, but it felt like a sensible, thrifty choice. And who doesn't love a bargain, especially when you're feeling a bit peaky? Now, we tiptoe into slightly more, let's call it nebulous territory. The perceived effectiveness. Did that cabbage leaf, dutifully applied to a swollen joint, actually do anything on a physiological level, beyond perhaps a mild cooling sensation? Or was its power more in the mind, that wonderfully complex and suggestible organ? This is where the ever-fascinating placebo effect likely throws its own rather large, leafy shadow. Imagine you're in pain, you're worried, someone you trust, your mother, the village elder, even a respected text like the ones written by Cato the Elder, that staunch Roman we discussed, who famously championed cabbage as a cure-all for practically everything from indigestion to skin sores, tells you with unwavering conviction that this specific preparation of cabbage will help. You follow the instructions meticulously. You crush the leaves just so, perhaps warm them gently by the fire, just as you were told, and as you apply it, you expect relief. You believe in its power, and sometimes that deeply held belief, that potent expectation, can genuinely trigger a physiological response. Your anxiety might lessen. Your perception of pain might decrease. The cabbage itself might just be an innocent bystander in this complex psychophysiological drama, but it gets all the credit. It's not to say there are no beneficial compounds in cabbage. We know it's packed with vitamins and anti-inflammatory compounds today, but the sheer range of ailments it was purported to cure stretches the bounds of its actual pharmacological capabilities. To put it mildly, it's that classic scenario if you believe hard enough that wearing your lucky socks will help you pass your exam. You might just study a bit harder, feel a bit calmer, and lo and behold, an A, were it the socks or the belief with cabbage, it was likely a generous helping of both. And this very point, the source of its perceived efficacy, is something that historians still argue whether the widespread, almost fanatical devotion to cabbage as a medicinal cure-all was primarily driven by its genuine, albeit perhaps modest, healing properties, or if its enduring popularity was more a testament to its comforting ubiquity in an era when truly effective medical interventions were few and far between. It's a gentle scholarly tussle that continues to this day. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, there's the immense power of cultural tradition. These remedies, these beliefs, they aren't just plucked out of thin air. They are woven into the very fabric of family and community, passed down through generations like cherished, if slightly odd, heirlooms, if your grandmother, and her grandmother before her, and her grandmother, stretching back into the mists of time, all swore by a warmed cabbage leaf on the chest for a cough, or a cabbage soup for a fever, then that's what you do. It's more than just a remedy. It's a ritual. It's a connection to your ancestors. It's a practice steeped in familiarity and trust. You remember your mother doing it for you when you were small? The slightly earthy smell of it, the comforting weight. To question it would be almost like questioning your heritage. It's the "this is how we've always done things" effect, and it's incredibly powerful. And sometimes these traditions came with their own little quirks. For instance, a rather charming, if not entirely scientific, lesser-known tidbit from some older Northern European folklore suggests that you should whisper your ailment to the cabbage before preparing it as a poultice. The idea being that the sickness would then transfer into the plant itself, rather than you. Now, you can chuckle, but imagine the comfort, the sense of agency. That small act might have given someone feeling helpless against illness. It's these layers of belief, of shared practice, of comforting ritual, that cemented the cabbage's place not just in the garden or on the table, but deep within the cultural psyche as a steadfast, if somewhat mysterious, healer. It wasn't just a vegetable, it was a tradition, a hope, and sometimes just maybe a little bit of actual help, all wrapped up in a bundle of leaves. And so, you see how our humble cabbage, this verdant hero of the people, reached such lofty heights, recommended by physicians, praised by scholars, and munched on by emperors. Remember Pliny the Elder practically writing love sonnets to it, and Cato, who seemed to think it could cure, well, everything. For centuries, it really was the go-to, the penicillin of the pre-penicillin world, the duct tape of the Dark Ages and beyond. But like all empires, even the empire of cabbage in formal medicine eventually begins to see, let's call them market corrections. You find yourself now, as the mists of the late medieval period begin to part, standing on the cusp of the Renaissance. There's a new scent in the air, a metallic tang mingling with the old familiar herbal aromas. It's the smell of change. And for our cruciferous champion, it signals the beginning of a very, very slow fade from the top of the medical charts. The shift isn't dramatic, not like a sudden cabbage market crash. Oh no, it's far more insidious. A gradual erosion of its authority within the hallowed halls of formalized medical practice. You walk through the newly paved streets of a bustling European city, perhaps Florence or Padua. The universities are buzzing. Thinkers are looking back at the classical texts. Yes, but some are starting to do something truly radical. They're looking at the world around them, and even inside the human body, with fresh eyes. You see, up until now, much of medicine was based on the writings of ancient authorities like Galen. If Galen said it, well, that was pretty much the final word. But now, figures like Andreas Vesalius are actually, dissecting human bodies. Imagine the scene: students huddled around a cadaver, the flickering candlelight illuminating exposed muscles and organs. A far cry from just reading a dusty old scroll. Vesalius, with his groundbreaking work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, in 1543, shows the world the actual human anatomy in unprecedented detail. This isn't directly about cabbage, of course, but it's a seismic shift in how medical knowledge is acquired. If we're learning new things about how the body is built, maybe our old ideas about how to fix it need a rethink too. Suddenly, just slapping a cabbage leaf on something because Galen or Cato, for that matter, said, so starts to feel a little quaint, at least to the forward thinkers. Then, swaggering onto the scene, comes a figure like Paracelsus in the early 16th century. Picture him a Swiss physician, alchemist, and general intellectual disruptor. He's brash, he's controversial, and he famously burned the works of Avicenna and Galen in a public bonfire. Talk about making a statement. Paracelsus champions a new idea called iatrochemistry, essentially medicine based on chemistry and alchemy. He believes that the body is a chemical system, and diseases are caused by chemical imbalances that require chemical remedies. He's all about minerals and metals, mercury, antimony, sulfur. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. He famously said, "The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison." It's a powerful idea, and it leads to the development of new, potent, and sometimes terrifyingly toxic medicines. Suddenly, the apothecary's shop starts to smell less like a vegetable garden and more like a very rudimentary chemistry lab. Compared to a carefully prepared tincture of antimony, our trusty cabbage, bless its fibrous heart, might seem a bit low-tech. You can almost hear a physician of the time puffing out his chest saying, "Cabbage. My dear fellow, we have chemicals. Now, much more precise, you see? Though one imagines the side effects of some of these early chemical treatments could make a bad case of indigestion from too much coleslaw seem like a day at the spa. This new chemical approach gains momentum. You see, it feels more specific. If disease is a specific chemical problem, then a specific chemical should fix it. This is a very different way of thinking than the old humoral theory, where everything was about balancing your blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a system where cabbage, with its perceived cooling or drying properties, fit in quite nicely. Remember now, the focus is shifting. Mainstream historical fact alert a bit later. In 1628, William Harvey publishes his work demonstrating the circulation of blood, driven by the heart as a pump. This is monumental. It's another piece of the puzzle showing the body as a complex, understandable system, not just a mysterious vessel of humors. Understanding blood flow changes everything. How you think about fevers, about how substances, medicines, or poisons travel through the body. It reinforces the idea that medicine should be based on understanding these physical and, increasingly, chemical processes. Alongside this, the spirit of empiricism is slowly, painstakingly, taking root. This is the idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience, from trying things out and seeing what happens. It's the very, very early ancestor of the clinical trial. Physicians, still fumbling in the dark in many ways, are beginning to document case studies with a bit more rigor. To compare treatments, it's a messy process, and historians still argue whether the initial impact of iatrochemistry led to genuinely better patient outcomes or simply more potent and sometimes more dangerous treatments. It's one thing to have a new theory, quite another for it to translate into actually helping people more often than, say, accidentally poisoning them with mercury. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some of these new chemical or potent remedies still carried a whiff of the fantastical. Alchemists and physicians might prescribe powdered mummy, believing it held some vital essence, or concoctions containing unicorn horn, often narwhal tusk. Let's be real, right alongside their genuinely innovative metallic salts. It's a transitional period, a fascinating, if slightly alarming, blend of the old and the new. You can almost imagine someone saying, "Right, take this antimony compound, and for good measure, here's a pinch of unicorn horn, and, oh, what the heck, maybe a cabbage poultice on the side. Can't hurt. Can it?" That last part, though, is what's changing in formal medicine. The "can't hurt" is being replaced by a desire for, does it demonstrably work, based on these new principles. So, as the Renaissance flows into the Enlightenment, you observe this gradual shift. medical texts start to feature these new chemical remedies more prominently. University curricula begin to incorporate iatrochemistry and the latest anatomical and physiological discoveries. Cabbage isn't gone, docked. It's still a food, still used in home remedies, still probably applied to a worrying number of ailments by your average peasant who hasn't got the memo or the money for the fancy new chemical elixirs. But its star in the firmament of official den learned medicine is undeniably dimming. The great physicians are increasingly looking towards the laboratory, towards the precise actions of purified substances, towards understanding the intricate machinery of the body. They're developing a deeper, albeit still rudimentary, understanding of disease processes that seem to call for more targeted interventions than a general cure, all like cabbage, no matter how much Cato loved it. The idea of a single plant fixing gout, deafness, plague, and bad moods, as some had previously claimed for cabbage, starts to sound less like sound medical advice and more like, well, something you'd hear from a particularly enthusiastic greengrocer. And let's be honest, even the most dedicated cabbage enthusiast might pause if offered a choice between a cabbage leaf and what was pitched as a scientifically formulated quicksilver potion for their ills, even if the potion had a 50-50 chance of making things spectacularly worse. The age of cabbage as a primary medical superstar in the formal sense is slowly but surely being pickled by progress. And so, as the gleaming, sterilized instruments of a new medical age took center stage, our humble cabbage, once a panacea in the physician's bag, found itself rather unceremoniously shown the door by mainstream science. But you know how it is with old habits, especially the ones that feel like they work, or at least the ones Grandma swore by. They don't just pack up and leave town, they linger. They find new homes in the quiet corners of folk wisdom, passed down through whispers and knowing glances, long after the doctors have scoffed and moved on to their latest injectable miracle. You see, even as official medical texts began to omit cabbage from their pharmacopoeias, it continued its reign in the realm of home remedies. And why wouldn't it? Think about it. Your great-aunt Mildred, living miles from the nearest town, isn't about to consult the New England Journal of Medicine when her knee swells up after a tussle with a stubborn goat. No, she's going to reach for what's familiar, what's available, and what doesn't cost a week's wages. And there, in the garden, sits the ever-reliable cabbage, plump and unassuming, ready for duty. It's cheap, it's everywhere, and for generations, it's been the go-to. This accessibility is key. Remember how even the Romans, like Cato, championed its widespread use because it was for everyone. That democratic appeal doesn't just vanish. The remedies themselves often mirrored those ancient practices we talked about. You can almost picture it a poultice, just like Pliny might have described, being carefully prepared. Those cool, sturdy leaves, perhaps slightly bruised to release their juices. That signature, slightly earthy aroma filling a rustic kitchen. You might see them applied to a sprained ankle, a bruised shin, or even a stubborn boil. The idea being to draw out the inflammation, the heat, the bad humors, a concept that, while medically outdated, still resonates in folk understanding. The logic is simple. It feels cool, it's moist, and if you believe it helps, well, that's half the battle, isn't it? It's the ultimate low-tech, high-touch solution. And then there's the cabbage leaf for engorgement, a remedy so persistent you can find it recommended on parenting forums and by lactation consultants even today. A cool, clean cabbage leaf, tucked into a bra. It sounds almost comical. A scene from a very specific kind of vegetable-themed sitcom. Yet countless women swear by its soothing relief. Is it the coolness? The shape some unstudied enzyme, who knows? but the tradition persists with a tenacity that would make a limpet proud. It wasn't just external applications. Cabbage juice, that potent elixir we touched upon earlier, also maintained its place in the folk medicine cabinet, particularly for digestive complaints. If you had a rumbly tummy, or what your grandmother might vaguely term acidity, or a delicate stomach, a shot of fresh cabbage juice might have been prescribed. Probably not the tastiest beverage you've ever imagined, a bit like liquid disappointment with a hint of lawn clippings. But if it settled things down, you wouldn't argue. Now, a fascinating mainstream historical fact that dovetails with this is the impact of the A. Flexner Report in 1910. This report radically reformed medical education in North America, standardizing it along scientific lines and effectively pushing many traditional and eclectic medical schools out of existence. This further solidified the divide between official medicine and what became folk, or alternative practices, creating even more space for remedies like cabbage to thrive in those non-mainstream niches. While doctors were learning about germ theory and complex pharmacology, folk healers and grandmothers were still relying on the empirical evidence of generations. You might wonder where you'd even encounter these cabbage traditions today, outside of a very specific internet rabbit hole. Well, they're often tucked away in old family recipe books, scribbled in the margins next to a recipe for coleslaw. They surface in conversations with older relatives, who might casually mention, "Oh, for a bee sting." We always used a cabbage leaf. You'll find them alive and well in certain rural communities, or within immigrant cultures that brought their ancestral remedies with them. The internet, of course, has become a vast digital grimoire, where forums and blogs dedicated to natural healing will almost certainly feature our cruciferous champion. People share their experiences, their grandmother's secrets, keeping these practices alive in a new, interconnected way. Sometimes, you even see echoes in natural health stores, where cabbage-derived supplements might be sold, hinting at these older uses without making direct medical claims. Here's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit. For you, some old European farming almanacs suggested that planting cabbage by the dark of the moon, while whispering your ailments to the seeds, would ensure the grown cabbages had extra healing power for those specific issues. It's a beautiful blend of sympathetic magic and practical horticulture, isn't it? You're essentially imbuing the plant with your intention, hoping it will absorb your woes as it grows. Probably not a method endorsed by your local agricultural extension office, but charming nonetheless. The persistence of these remedies is a fascinating study in itself. Historians still argue whether the perceived success of these cabbage applications in folk settings was due to yet undiscovered phytochemical properties, the powerful psychosomatic effect of belief, or simply the fact that many minor ailments resolve on their own, with or without a leafy brassica pressed against them. Perhaps it's a little of all three. The body is a remarkable healer, and sometimes the ritual of care, the application of something cool and soothing, is enough to tip the scales. You don't often see a dramatic, cinematic moment where someone is saved from the brink by a cabbage leaf in these modern folk tales. It's more about the everyday aches, the minor discomforts, the things that mainstream medicine might deem too trivial, or for which its solutions are too expensive or invasive. It's the quiet, persistent undercurrent of self-reliance, of using what nature provides, a tradition that stretches back, as we've seen, for millennia. And even if the scientific evidence is debated, the cultural resonance is undeniable. That cabbage in your crisper drawer. It's carrying a lot more history than just potential for a good stir-fry. It's a link to a long green line of healers, warriors, and resourceful ancestors, all just trying to feel a little bit better, one leaf at a time. And so, here we are, at the very end of our rather verdant voyage, looking back across the centuries at the long, strange, and surprisingly persistent legacy of leafy cures, specifically our humble, unassuming friend, the cabbage. You've journeyed with me from sun-drenched ancient fields where philosophers in flowing robes pondered its perplexing, almost mystical powers, through the cool, damp air of dimly lit medieval apothecaries where its leaves were patiently pounded into pungent poultices, all the way to, well, your very own kitchen, where it probably just sits patiently in the crisper drawer, radiating a quiet, vegetable dignity. It's been quite the odyssey, hasn't it? From a supposed cure for baldness, remember that particularly hopeful gem from Pliny the Elder, who seemed to think cabbage could solve just about anything if applied with enough conviction, to a potent ward against the evil eye, especially if you hung a particularly robust specimen. Just so, over the main doorway, we've seen it recommended, with utmost seriousness, for everything from the painful throes of gout, by simply strapping the raw, cool leaves directly to your afflicted foot. Imagine the squelch to, if you recall our chat about Roman dinner parties, ensuring the continued sobriety of even the most determined reveler. That was a claim Cato the Elder, that staunch, no-nonsense Roman statesman, championed with an almost fanatical devotion. Yes, Cato, a figure renowned for his pragmatism, wrote extensively about cabbage, utterly convinced it could cure practically anything under the Italian sun. It was the Roman equivalent of an apple a day, only, considerably more cabbagey, and perhaps involving more direct skin contact. You've heard tales, whispered down through the ages, of cabbage being used to divine the future if you prepared and consumed it under a perfectly full moon while, perhaps, reciting a specific incantation, or maybe hopping on one foot. Okay, I might have embellished the hopping part, but some rituals we explored were nearly that specific, weren't they? And then there was that rather distinctly aromatic application we discussed, the one for drawing out ill humors from a feverish patient. Let's just say it involved a warm, wilted cabbage compress and a very, very patient individual, probably holding their breath. We've certainly encountered our fair share of remedies that make you tilt your head and wonder if they were just trying to see what they could get people to do. Feeling a bit down in the dumps, are we? Try wearing this large cabbage leaf like a tiny, rather despairing, organic hat. It's a universe away from a modern therapist's couch, though perhaps equally effective if the sheer unadulterated absurdity of it managed to make you laugh, a cure in itself. Historians still argue whether the peasants' steadfast embrace of cabbage throughout the harsh medieval centuries and beyond was purely pragmatic after all. It grew with reliable ease in varied climates. It was undeniably cheap. It filled the belly when little else would, or if there was a genuine, deeply ingrained belief in its more mystical, almost talismanic, protective qualities. Qualities like its supposed ability to absorb negativity from a room, or even draw out sickness. A quirky tidbit we touched upon when discussing those old household superstitions and warding rituals back in, Section 7. The line between practical, observable nutrition and deeply rooted folkloric medicine was, as we've seen time and time again, often wonderfully, bewilderingly, and sometimes hilariously blurred. But here's the truly fascinating part. The little twist at the end of our tale, amidst all the wildly exaggerated claims and, let's be perfectly honest, some downright bizarre, head-scratching practices. There's a persistent kernel of truth that modern science is now, rather belatedly, nodding its white-coated head in agreement with. You see, while that cabbage leaf perched jauntily on your head probably isn't going to magically regrow your hair or cure your existential melancholy, Sorry to be the bearer of disappointing news there. The stuff you actually eat is genuinely, certifiably packed with goodness. Your modern-day alchemist, the nutritionist armed with charts and studies, will tell you that cabbage is a fantastic source of vitamin C. Yes, the very same vitamin C that helps bolster your immune system. Maybe not quite warding off the Black Death, as some desperate medieval texts rather optimistically suggested, but certainly helping your body fight off a common cold, which, back then, without antibiotics or even basic sanitation, could easily escalate into something much more serious. And then there's vitamin K, absolutely crucial for proper blood clotting and maintaining bone health. Remember all those cabbage poultices we talked about for wounds and sores? While the direct application of a crushed leaf might have been more about the soothing coolness, the placebo effect of doing something. No, or perhaps even some mild antiseptic properties. A diet consistently rich in vitamin K would have genuinely helped with healing from the inside out, making those bodies more resilient. It's also absolutely loaded with fiber, which, as your gut microbiome will happily gurgle its approval for, is brilliant for smooth and happy digestion. Perhaps not quite the dramatic cleansing of all internal woes and obstructions that some ancient healers promised with a flourish, but certainly a good, solid start for a happy, well-functioning digestive system. You might not be banishing actual demons with it by eating a hearty stew, but you're definitely giving your beneficial gut flora a 5-star, Michelin-worthy meal. Modern science also points to some very interesting compounds called glucosinolates, found abundantly in cabbage and its cruciferous cousins. These have been and continue to be studied for their potential anti-cancer properties. Now, this is a very long way from claiming cabbage is a cure for cancer. Absolutely not. And we must be exceptionally clear and responsible on that point. But it does suggest that some of those ancient intuitions, those gut feelings about cabbage being a protective or strengthening food, weren't entirely off the mark, even if their explanations involved, say, its inherent earthy vigor or its phlegm-balancing nature according to humoral theory. And if you happen to choose a vibrant red cabbage, you get a lovely bonus dose of anthocyanins, which are powerful antioxidants that give it that beautiful, rich color and help your body fight off those pesky free radicals. So, while it certainly won't, as one particularly enthusiastic 17th century herbalist boldly claimed, cureth the grievous bite of a mad dog ye please. Please. See a qualified medical doctor immediately for that, not the vegetable aisle. It does offer some very real, scientifically backed health benefits. It's a beautiful and frankly, quite funny contrast when you lay it all out, isn't it? The historical claims, so grand and sweeping, cabbage as a panacea, a universal antidote, a magical ward against all unseen evils, and then the modern validation, so much more modest, more specific, but grounded in the quiet, precise language of vitamins, minerals, and complex phytochemicals. It's a bit like discovering your wonderfully eccentric great aunt, the one who told you fantastical stories about talking to squirrels and finding ancient treasure in the back garden, actually left you a very sensible and surprisingly valuable stock portfolio. You deeply appreciate the sensible, beneficial outcome. Of course, but you can't help but miss the thrilling tales of the talking squirrels just a little. So, as we gently leave our leafy protagonist to its continued, albeit now more scientifically understood, service to humanity, you can see how its long and storied history is a mirror to our own evolving understanding of health, of nature, and of the often winding, sometimes bewildering path from folklore to verifiable fact. It's a humble testament to how ancient peoples, through keen observation, trial and error, and perhaps a healthy dose of wishful thinking, sometimes stumbled upon things that truly worked, even if their explanations for why they worked were a charming tapestry of myth and metaphor. The cabbage, in its crisp, unassuming, tightly packed layers, holds not just water and nutrients, but centuries of human hope, deep-seated superstition, and a surprising amount of enduring dietary wisdom. Next time you're slicing one up for coleslaw, or simmering it in a stew, perhaps you'll give a little nod to Cato, or spare a fleeting thought for the medieval peasant, hoping its satisfying crunch would keep the doctor and his leeches far, far away. You're participating in a very, very long and rather flavorful tradition. Okay, the time has come to gently close the book on our Cabbage Chronicle. Feel the stories we've shared begin to soften around the edges, like steam rising from a comforting bowl of soup on a cool evening. Let the historical whispers and the scientific murmurs blend into a peaceful hum, a quiet reminder of nature's simple, enduring gifts. As you drift, perhaps you'll even dream of verdant fields stretching out under a soft, moonlit sky. Thank you for joining me on this leafy exploration. Until next time, may your nights be restful and your thoughts be calm. Sleep well. Whispered Sleep Well